Russians had turned each building into a strong point, and every one had to be destroyed in turn with grenades, Molotov cocktails, and satchel charges. It was a bloody and exhausting business, but by 1400 hours the Russians were in retreat. The Finns pressed on for 2 more days, reaching the Itojoki River on the 23rd of December, when Mannerheim called off the attack. Since the beginning of the offensive on the 7th of December, Talvala's force of 6,000 men had suffered 2,000 casualties, of whom 630 had been killed. The Finns counted more than 4,000 Russian bodies, and estimated that at least another 5,000 had been wounded, of whom some 600 had become prisoners. Further south, along the northern shore of Lake Ladoga, General Haglund launched a counter-offensive against the Soviet 168th Division, which was spread out along dozens of kilometers of snowbound road. As Finnish ski troops swept around the Russian flanks, chopping into the columns in elongated pockets, the Russian troops deployed for all-round defense and began digging in. By the second week in January, Russian columns had been cut into 11 pockets, known to the Finns as motis. Haglund barely had enough men to maintain a permanent presence at each moti, and instead conducted a mobile siege, with ski troops keeping the Russians off balance through a series of hit-and-run attacks. Most motis were too powerful to attack directly. They contained scores of tanks, hundreds of guns, and the men could survive for a time by eating their horses, and by supply drops from the Soviet Air Force. The Finns set up anti-aircraft guns around the motis, and sometimes succeeded in duplicating Russian signals requesting logistic drops, so that the supplies came floating down to their own rather than the Soviet positions. The Russians attempted to supplement the airdrop by bringing in supplies across Lake Ladoga at night, but these columns were frequently ambushed by Finnish ski patrols. As Soviet supplies dwindled, pocket after pocket was faced with the choice of surrendering to the Finns or attempting to break out. Invariably, they chose the latter course. The 3,600 Russians inside the East Lameti moti came charging out in mid-January, hoping to overwhelm the single battalion besieging them, but ran into withering machine gun fire. After the massacre, the Finns counted more than 3,000 Russian dead, including a Soviet general who was surrounded by the bodies of 4 female typists, each clutching a rifle. By the end of January, 8 of the 11 motis along the northern shore of Lake Ladoga had fallen to General Haglund's forces. During December, the news from Finland had been greeted in the Kremlin with disquiet, then alarm, and finally rage. In late December, Stalin met with his military chiefs. The Soviet leader was painfully aware that the world was comparing his own failure to defeat Finland with Hitler's rapid destruction of Poland 3 months earlier. He ordered the execution of some of the officers who had failed, but there was to be no wholesale bloodletting. Stalin knew that the poor performance of the Soviet army was partly due to his own purge of senior and middle-ranking officers. He was a survivor, and his response to the crisis was pragmatic. The Leningrad military district that had been conducting the campaign was reorganized and became the Northwestern Army Group, or Front. To command at the operational level, Stalin chose General Semyon Konstantinovich Timoshenko, a former barrel maker, who had proved an effective army commander in the short Polish campaign. Timoshenko's first step was to reorganize the Northwestern Front, creating 2 armies, 7th and 14th. Once he established a new command structure, he moved in fresh divisions. Like Meretskov before him, he identified a 16-kilometer wide corridor at Sumy as the best place to effect a breakthrough. Here he assembled 10 infantry divisions, 5 tank brigades, and 2,800 guns, enough artillery to give him a front-wide ratio of 50 guns per kilometer. During the last weeks of January, Soviet patrols probed the Mannerheim line, identifying the location of bunkers, and even bringing back pieces of concrete for analysis. On the 1st of February, Northwestern Front's artillery opened up, pumping 300,000 shells into Finnish positions in the first 24 hours. In the Suma sector alone, 400 shells per minute rained on Finnish positions. Under this crushing bombardment, some of the Finnish fortifications began to crumble. By the 10th of February, the Soviets were attacking all along the line, forcing the Finns into a battle of attrition they could not win. To the alarm of the defenders, Finnish batteries were no longer responding to Russian shelling. The Finns were running out of ammunition, and battery commanders were now under strict orders not to fire, except in cases of dire emergency. Finnish soldiers watched with frustration as masses of Russian infantry deployed to their front, and their guns remained silent. They now had to rely on machine guns, rifles and mortars to prevent a breakthrough. But still, the Mannerheim line held. The Russians attempted to outflank the line by sending columns across the ice of the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga. Finnish coastal batteries sent armor-piercing shells smashing into the frozen surface. Airbursts of shrapnel tore through the Soviet ranks, pushing them to flee across the fractured ice, where many hundreds drowned. On the 12th of February, a thick fog blanketed the Gulf of Finland. The Russians, advancing under its cover, got to within 50 meters of the Finnish shore when the fog lifted and the defenders' machine guns cut them down in heaps. The Finns still had astonishing successes, but Soviet numbers began to tell. By the second week in February, Finnish reinforcements consisted mainly of 16-year-old boys and reservists in their mid-50s. On the 14th of February, casualties in the Suma sector reached crisis point, and Mannerheim authorized a withdrawal. But with Suma gone, the remainder of the front was no longer viable. At 1600 hours on the 15th of February, Mannerheim ordered a general retreat back to an intermediate line, which was much less fortified. There were only two things which could save Finland: the spring and the intervention of foreign powers, particularly Britain and France. Unfortunately, the winter of 1939-40 was one of the coldest and longest of the 20th century. Foreign intervention was proving as illusory as the spring. Some foreign help had arrived, but it was in the form of semi-trained companies and battalions of idealistic volunteers, mainly from Sweden, but with contingents from many other European countries and the United States. On the 29th of February, Finnish diplomats had been on the point of accepting new Russian demands when an urgent message arrived from Paris. The French government urged Finland to fight on and promised the immediate dispatch of 50,000 troops and 100 bombers. On the strength of this promise, the Finns rejected Moscow's offer. But the French offer was dependent on the cooperation of Great Britain, and while Britain wished to send forces to Norway and Sweden to interfere with Germany's supplies of iron ore, London was not necessarily interested in going to Finland to fight the Russians. In addition, any Anglo-French intervention force destined for Finland was going to have to get the permission of the Norwegian and Swedish governments to cross their territory, and this was something Oslo and Stockholm were not prepared to allow. Finland made a desperate appeal to Norway and Sweden to open their borders, knowing that the appeal would be rejected. Finnish diplomats had already decided they had no choice other than to accede to Russian demands, and on the 13th of March signed a ceasefire in Moscow, which gave Stalin everything he had wanted. The Russo-Finnish War had lasted just 105 days. Finland had lost 25,000 dead and 43,500 wounded, out of a total population of fewer than 4 million. The Soviet losses were much greater, at least 250,000 dead, and about the same number wounded. The Finns took 5,000 Russian prisoners, a surprisingly low number that says much about the severity of the fighting. Though Finland had had to bow to the inevitable, she had earned a reputation as a formidable small power, a nation not to be meddled with. Conversely, even though the Soviets eventually succeeded, the reputation of the Soviet army as a fighting force had been destroyed. American and British observers rated the USSR as a third-rate military power, a hapless giant incapable of defending itself. So too did the Germans. In fact, in April 1940, the Supreme Military Soviet met to sift through the lessons of the war and push through a program of radical reform. It was just in time.